that song.
To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause.
Pokemon! Gotta catch them all.
Okay, we're ready to read chapter 10 now.
Are we though? Are we?
I think we are.
Are we?
We had brownies, so we're all excited.
Are you?
Things.
Are we? Are we?
You're not excited that you had a brownie?
Pokemon!
Okay. Stupid bleated his rump as he struggled to his feet, pushing sharply into Peemer's belly. Curled on Peemer's shoulder, Farley gave a sleepy complaint, which rapidly changed to a squeak of alarm. Peemer rolled over, away from both his friends for fear of injuring either, and got stiffly to his feet. There wasn't anything alarming in the clearing about his small shelter, but as his eyes swung about, he caught the unexpected distant blur of bright red on the river. Startled, he brushed aside an obscuring bough and saw, just where the river began to narrow between the plains, 3 single-masted ships carrying brilliant red sails. Even as he watched in surprise, the ships altered course, their red sails flapping as they were first turned into the wind and then were carried by momentum up onto the muddy beach. Fascinated at the sight of ships on his river, Peemer moved further from his shelter, stroking to reassure Farley, who chittered questions at him. He was marginally conscious of Stupid brushing against his bare leg as he reached the outermost screen of trees. Not that anyone from the ships could possibly see him at this distance. He watched as one will review a dream, while people jumped out of the ships, men, women, and children. Sails were furled fully, not just thrown across the boom. A line was formed to convey bundles and packages from the ships across the muddy beaches to the higher, drier banks. Holdless men from the north, wondered Peemer. But surely he had heard that they were passed through Torek first, so that their inclusion into the southern hold was unobtrusive, and the old-timers had no cause to complain. Whoever these people were, they looked as if they intended to stay a while. As Peemer continued to watch the disembarkation, he became aware of a growing sense of indignation that anyone would dare invade his privacy, would have the audacity to make a camp and set up cooking fires with great kettles balanced on spits across the flames, just as if they belonged here. This was his river and Stupid's grazing grounds. His! Not theirs to litter with tent, kettle, and fire. What if the old-timers just happened to fly this way? There'd be trouble. Didn't those folks know any better? Setting up in the sight of everything. Farley distracted him by protesting her hunger. Can you pour that yourself, babe?
Probably not.
Do you want my help?
I'm going to try to pour it myself.
Please don't have a milk pouring emergency. Stupid had fallen to his customary sampling of every type of greenery in his immediate area. Absently, Peemer reached in the pouch at his belt for a handful of nut meats he'd kept there to pacify Farley. Daintily, she took the offerings, but informed him with a querulous cheep that this had better not be all she was given to eat that morning. Peemer chewed on a nut himself, trying to figure out who these people were and what they were about. One group was now separating itself from those bustling about tents or filling the huge kettles with water drawn from the river. This group moved purposefully toward the far end of the field, and then the individuals spread out. Long chopping blades flashed in the sun, and suddenly Peemer knew who they were and what they were doing. Southerners had come to harvest the numbweed bushes, now full of sap and strong with the juice that eased pain. He wrinkled his nose in disgust. It'd take them days to harvest that field, and each kettleful would require 3 days of stewing to reduce the tough plant to pulp. Another day would be required to strain the juice, and the juice had to be simmered down to the right consistency to make the numbweed salve. Peemer knew that Master Oldive took the purest of the resultant salve and did something else with it to make it a powder for internal use. He sighed deeply, because the intruders would be here for days and days. The camp may have been set up a good hour's walk from him, and undoubtedly he could keep from being noticed. He wouldn't escape, however, even at this distance, from the stench of boiling numbweed, for that smell was pervasive, and the prevailing breeze right now was from the sea.
Stop kicking the cushion that I'm sitting on?
Y'all share your space. It was infuriating to be forced out of his place. It was infuriating to be forced out of his place just when he'd gotten everything arranged to his convenience so that he could feed himself, Farley, and Stupid, had shelter from the tropical storms at night, and safety from threatfall whenever it came. Then it occurred to him that perhaps these weren't Southerners, but a work party from the north. He knew that Master Oldeye preferred southern-grown herbs. That was why Sibel had made that trip not long ago to bring back sacks and sacks of medicinal things. Surely he'd brought enough, or maybe this was a new arrangement with the old-timers, who surely couldn't object to the healer. But northern ships had many colored sails. Manolia told him that seaholders prided themselves on the intricacy of their sail patterns. Plain red sail did suggest Southerners, whom everyone knew broke northern tradition whenever possible. Also, those work groups were moving with the familiarity of much practice. Pemer grinned to himself. One thing sure, he wasn't going to announce his presence right now. Sure as eggs hatched, he'd get himself included in harvesting numbweed. He'd just take what he needed and work around them, through the forest until he got to the seashore, well east of them, and well away from the stink of boiling numbweed. So he made a neat bundle of his woven mat and tied it with a vine thong, ignoring the chittering of Farley, who disapproved of his activity and of the fact that he was ignoring her gradually more insistent requests for food.
Dude, fiend, fire lizard.
He stared at the walls of his little shelter and decided that there was just the chance that someone might hunt in the forest and discover his rude hole. He dismantled the sheets of woven grass and hid them in the thick leaves of nearby bushes. He couldn't remove the clearing he'd made, but he scuffed up the tamped-down earth and scattered dead fronds here and there so that a casual glance would make it appear a natural clearing. He silenced Farley's now urgent complaints by heading for the river. His fish trap, tied to a sunken thread tree, held more than enough to feed her amply. He gutted what remained after she was sated and wrapped them in broad leaves, added that to his bundle. He hesitated a few moments before tossing the fish trap back into the water. Surely no one would notice it unless someone tripped over the silly thing, which seemed highly unlikely, and the fish it captured wouldn't suffer. He'd leave it, and then he'd have ample eating when he returned here. He made his way through the forest, skirting the wide plain, pausing to drink when he crossed a small contributory stream and to let Stupid rest a while. The little fellow's short legs tired quickly, and while the creature was no great weight, he did seem to get heavier on those occasions when Pemer took pity and carried him a while. Farley flitted ahead of them and behind, venturing up through the trees into the sky occasionally, twittering a scold that Pemer didn't understand but assumed was directed at the invaders. "At least you're not afraid of them," said Pemer, when she returned to her perch on his shoulder, begging caresses. She leaned against his finger as he stroked her neck, murmuring sweetly for him to continue as she twined her tail lightly about his neck. "If only they weren't making numbweed, I'd be willing to introduce us all." Or would he? Pemer wondered. It would have been so simple to go down and find out if they were Southerners. Imagine their surprise when he wandered in as easy as you please. They'd be startled, they would, and amazed when he told them his adventures here in the South. Yes, but then they'd want to know how he'd got here, and he wasn't at all certain he ought to tell the exact truth. Surely it wasn't unusual for a bold, holdless man to try to sneak south, particularly if he had merited his holder's displeasure. Pemer didn't have to mention that he'd acquired Farley in the north, and certainly not that he'd removed her from Moran's hearth in Nabul Hold. Southerners would naturally assume that he'd found the little queen fire lizard here in some beach clutch. Stupid's acquisition posed no problem at all. He could tell the truth there. Pemer could always pretend that he didn't know where the southern hold was, and had been endlessly searching. Yes, that was it. He could say he'd stolen a small boat and had had an absolutely ghastly trip south, which was only the truth. Yes, but where had he sailed from? Ista? That was too small a hold to steal a boat from. Egan? Maybe even Karoon? The Southerners were not likely to check with anyone. "Hello, what are you doing sneaking around here?" A tall girl stepped into his path, blocking his way. On one shoulder was a bronze fire lizard, on the other a brown, both eyeing Farley intently. She let out an apologetic squawk, as startled as Pemer, as she also dug her talons into his shoulder and tightened her tail about his neck. All that came out of his mouth was a choked cry of astonishment. A quick chirp from the little bronze caused Farley to relax her tail. Pemer turned his head toward her, annoyed that she hadn't warned him. "It's not her fault," said the girl with a wide smile, easing her weight to one leg as she enjoyed Pemer's discomfiture. She had a pack strapped to her shoulders, a belt with a variety of pouches, some empty, dark hair wrapped with a band tightly about her head so strands wouldn't tangle in branches, and thick-soled sandals on her feet as well as shin guards tied about her lower legs. Mir, and she indicated the bronze, and Tala know how to be silent when they wish, and when they realized that she was already impressed, we all wanted to see who had got a gold. I'm Shara, from the Southern Hold. She held out her hand, palm up. How'd you get down here? We didn't see any wreckage as we came along the coast. I've been here 3 threadfalls already, said Pemer, crossing her palm quickly in case she was the sort of person who sensed when someone lied. Landed up near the big lagoon, which was also partially true. Near the big lagoon? Shara's face expressed concern. Then you weren't alone? The others were killed? That lagoon is treacherous in high tide. You don't see the outside shelf of rocks until you're right on them. I guess being little, I sort of slid over okay. Pemer felt it was safe to seem sorrowful. That's all past history for you, lad, said Shara, her deep musical voice compassionate. If you survived the southern seas and 3 threadfalls holdless, I'd say you belong in the south. I belong here? Suddenly the prospect heartened Pemer. Shara was as perceptive as the harper. The thought of being permitted to stay on in this beautiful land, walking where no one else, maybe not even Shara, had ever trod before, made Pemer's heart tip over. Yes, I'd say you belong, said Shara, wide mouth curled in a smile. So, what name shall I call you by? If she hadn't given him the option to state a name, any name, not necessarily his own, Pemer might have prevaricated. Instead, he answered her with a grin. I'm Pemer of Pern. Shara threw back her head and laughed at his audacity, but she also laid her arm about his shoulders and gave him a companionable squeeze. I like you, Pemer of Pern. What have you named your little queen? Farley? That's a pretty name. And is that little runner beast a friend of yours, too? Stupid? Yes, but he's just joined us. His mother was thread-scored last fall, but he keeps up with us. Keeps up with you? You mean you saw the ships land? Sure. So I'm going to harvest numbweed, too. Shara laughed again at the intense disgust in his tone, and Pemer found himself grinning at the infectiousness of her humor. And that decided you to make tracks away from wherever you were? Can't blame you, Pemer of Pern. Her eyes glinted with humor, and she added in a conspiratorial tone, I make it my special job to gather other leaves and herbs that grow in this area. Generally takes me the entire time they're rendering the numbweed. I wouldn't mind helping you with that, suggested Pemer, slyly giving her a look. He was only just aware of how much he had missed the interchange with someone of like mind. I'd be glad of the right sort of help, and you'll have to keep up with me. I've got a lot to do while they muck about with the numbweed. There's a northern healer who sent me a special request. I thought you southerners kept away from the north. Pemer decided it was time to be ignorantly discreet. Well, there are some things that need to be traded back and forth. But I thought Bend and Weir doesn't permit. Dragon riders, yes. And there was a curious tone in her voice when she said dragon riders that caught Pemer's quick ear. It was a mocking derision that surprised him, accustomed as he was to the respect with which all dragon riders, except the southern old-timers, were treated. But Shara meant the southern old-timers when she said dragon riders. No, we trade with northerners. Again, that odd derision, as if northerners went up to southern standards. All manner of southern plants grow bigger and better than the same things in your old north. Numbweed for one, feather herb and tough grass for fever, redwort for infection, pinkroot for bellyache, all manner of things. She had begun to walk now, gesturing Pemer to follow her deeper into the forest, her stride swinging as if she knew exactly where she was going in the tangled depths, had traveled this way many times before. At some stages of the next few days, Pemer had occasion to regret not harvesting numbweed, a comparatively simple task compared to Shara's search, which included digging, scrambling under thorny bushes that scratched his back raw, and climbing trees for parasitic growths. He felt he had found a taskmaster in her equal to old Bessel at Nabole Hold. However, a taskmaster far more interesting, for Shara talked about the properties and virtues of the roots for which they dug, the leaves for which they climbed only the healthiest of trees, well sheltered from the worst ravages of threadfall, or equally elusive herbs that lived obscurely where other bushes had thorns to scratch. Shara had a ware-hide jacket with her, but he had nothing to shield him from lacerations. She was quite ready and prepared to daub him with numbweed whenever necessary, but she did have to point out that his size made him the logical person to pursue the shyest herbs in their protective environment. Nothing would permit Peemer to lose honor in Shara's eyes. The first evening she built a tiny hot fire, knowing which of the southern woods burned best, and cooked him the finest eating he'd had since he'd left the Harper Hall. His contribution was fish, and hers a combination of tubers and herbs. The 3 fire lizards devoured their portions of the stew with as much gusto as he did. To Peemer's pleased surprise, Shara did not question him again about his journey south, nor his imaginary companions. When she commented on his knowledgeable handling of Little Stupid, he did admit to having been a herdsman's boy in mountain holds. Otherwise, Shara seemed determined to introduce him to the south, and gave him endless lectures on its beauties and advantages. She told him of explorations up the river, his river, which had ended in an unnavigable and dangerous marshland of tremendous breadth. The explorers had reluctantly decided that rather than get lost one by one at blind waterways, they had better abandon the search until they could make an aerial survey of the area, a survey unlikely to be accomplished until one of the old-timers boredly agreed to the outing. Peemer hadn't been in Shara's company for more than several hours before he learned how poor her opinion was of dragon riders. While he had to agree to her estimate of the old-timers, he found it very difficult not to call Natan to her as comparison. He felt he was being disloyal to the Fort Weir leader when he forced himself to keep silent. But a favorable mention of Natan might bring a query as to how he, a lowly herdsman boy, came to know so much about a Weir leader. Shara had a light blanket, which she was quite willing to share with Peemer at night. She also acquainted him with the thick bush leaves, which made a more fragrant and comfortable bedding than the springier fronds he'd been using. The leaves also had no tendency to drive annoying splinters into soft flesh. Shara knew a great deal, Peemer realized, for she also had him feeding Stupid on a particular plant that would make up for the lack of nourishment from his dead mother. Peemer would never have known that was why Stupid had browsed so continuously, a dietary instinct rather than an insatiable appetite. The second day, after a light meal of fruit and tubers, which Shara had baked in the ashes of the fire, the two continued on a steady course south. The thick forest gave occasionally onto grassy meadows, dotted with herd beasts and runners who would gallop wildly away when the first scent of the humans reached them. Ow! By the middle of the next day they had reached higher ground, more frequently broken by meadows, until suddenly they came to a low bluff, as if the land had suddenly fallen away from the level on which they stood. Below, stretching to the far hazy horizon, was a marshland, fingered with black strips of water which wove and disappeared about the clumps of drier land on which grew giant bushes of stiff, tough grasses. "We were well met, Peemer," said Shara. "With you to help, we could get twice as much, manage a larger raft with 2 to steer it, and return down the river to the ships in very good time." "But not," she grinned down at him, "until they've had time to barrel the numbweed. Here's what we do now." She showed him by a map she scratched in the dirt at their feet with her belt knife, and by pointing in the appropriate directions. The third large channel to their right was actually the river that led to the sea. That much the earlier exploration had determined. There was plenty of the valuable tuft grasses between the bluff and that safe third channel. They would be able to half swim, half wade across the intervening channels, using the fire lizards to scare away the water snakes, which could wring the blood out of a person's arm or leg. Peemer didn't believe that water snakes could grow that big, but he had to credit her warning when she showed him the fine band of puncture marks on her left arm, where a water snake had wound its coils and left the myriad points of its toe teeth. Not a denizen of these parts, Shara assured him blithely, and brushed aside his pity by saying that the marks would fade gradually. Then she suggested that, being taller, she'd better carry Stupid across the waters on her shoulders. As they reached each grassy island, they cut the tufts from the grass for the therapeutic seeds that grew along each stem. The larger branches were laid aside and tied in bundles.
This all gives me bad vibes.
To be bound together for the raft. Shara said that the branches absorbed water gradually, but the raft would float long enough to get them safely to the river's mouth. The heart of the grass plant, just above the root ball, was its most important part. This was dried and pounded into a powder that was the best medicine known for reducing fever, especially firehead fever, about which Pemer had never heard. Shara told him that it seemed to occur only in the south, and generally only during the first month of the spring season, now well past. Something, they thought, rolled up on the spring tide so that beaches were avoided during that month by everyone. Pemer might have avoided both numbweed stench and water snake puncture, but he certainly worked as hard beside Shara as he had that one day in the Bowl Hold, a day that seemed to belong to another boy entirely. Not this one, that was alternately soaked and dried to parchment as they harvested the precious fruits of the swamp grass. The fourth day they made the raft, binding layer after layer of the grass stalks and then forcing them into a vaguely boat-like shape by tying the ends into stubby prows, leaving a central hollow for their precious cargo and stupid. Shara had taught her fire lizards to hunt when they were in the wild, but she had also managed to train them to bring their catch to her. They returned that fourth evening with the strangest-looking creature Pemer had ever seen. Shara identified it as a were-sport. It was far too small to be like the watchwares that Pemer knew as nocturnal hold guardians in the north, but it was bigger than fire lizards, which it also somewhat resembled. Fortunately, it was almost dead when the delighted Mir and Tala deposited it on the ground by Shara's feet. She dispatched it with a deft prick of her knife, and grinning at Pemer for his horrified expression, proceeded to disembowel it, throwing the offal far out into the black waters, which ruffled briefly as the snakes took the offering. May look a sight, but roasted in its skin, a weresport is a very good eating. So we'll stuff it with a bit of white tuber and some grass shoots, and we'll have a meal fit for a lord holder. When she saw Pemer's dubious expression as she completed her arrangements, she laughed. There's a lot of strange beasties in this part of the south, as if all the animals you have up north got mixed up somehow. A weresport isn't a fire lizard, and it isn't a were. For one thing, it's a daytime beast, and weres are nocturnal. Sun blinds them. Then there's far more varieties of snake here in the north than in the north, or so I'm told. Sometimes I'd like to go north just to see all the differences, but then again, and Shara shrugged, her eyes wandering over the lush, deserted, and strangely beautiful marshlands, this is where I hold. I haven't seen half enough of it yet to begin to appreciate all its complexity. She pointed due south with her bloody knife blade. There's mountains down there that never lose their snow. Not that I've seen snow, or them, or on the ground, though my brother has told me about it. I wouldn't like to be as cold as he says it gets in the north when there's snow on the ground. Oh, it's not bad, replied Pemer reassuringly, and a trifle pleased to be able to talk on a subject he did know. Rather invigorating, in fact, cold is. Snows are fun, too. Then you don't have to... He caught himself. He'd been about to say you don't have to report to all work sections at the Harper Hall. Do as much work. Shara didn't seem to notice his brief hesitation, or that he had substituted another phrase. She gave him a grin. We don't always work this hard in southern either, Pemer, but now it's time to harvest numbweed and get the tough seeds and bush hearts, if we didn't have them. And she shrugged to indicate a very unpleasant alternative. Then she made a trench in the red ashes of the fire, lined it with thick water plant leaves, which began to hiss and exude a steamy fragrance, deftly inserted the stuffed weresport, folded over the leaves, then carefully knifed the hot ashes in place and sat back. There. Dinner won't be long, and there's enough for all.
I don't like that girl. She gives off bad vibes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.